Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here to bring you another science fiction wrap-up. This one I'm focusing on the question of should you read the Sun Eater series by Christopher Ruocchio, as well as providing some other reviews of science fiction and fantasy books I've been reading recently. This video, as always, is going to be spoiler-free, so whether or not you've read this or any other series that I'm going to be talking about today, you can definitely keep watching. If you're new to my channel, consider subscribing if you like science fiction and fantasy. And all that being said, let's get started. First up, I received a copy of Kingdoms of Death by Christopher Ruocchio, which is the fourth book in the Sun Eater science fiction series. And while this is book 4, as I mentioned, I'm going to keep this entirely spoiler-free for those of you that have not started the series or are not caught up. And I think for a lot of people, they are seeing these series going around online. These books have been really buzzy, especially with the new release coming out. And so I think a lot of people are trying to decide whether or not to read them, but it's just kind of hard sometimes to tell from other reviews whether or not you're going to enjoy something. So I'm going to help to try to kind of hone you in on what the series is, what it is not, and kind of give you a better idea of it. So if you're not familiar, this is a science fiction series, so it's set in a future where humanity has expanded beyond Earth. We follow a man named Hadrian, and this story, essentially the entire series, is his story or chronicle of his life. We find out that he has grown quite a reputation. He has lived an incredible life over a long span of time. And so in the first book, called Empire of Silence, we follow him as he begins his long journey. And of course, I can't really talk too much in specifics about where he is by book 4, but I will say that it's a long journey where at the beginning of the story, he is the son of a great ruler, and he, in his position, kind of loses some of his status and has to work his way up. And so the story follows him in his adventures. He goes to different planets and has to really find his way around and try to, again, kind of move up in society. So I will say that the first book is interesting. It's a bit of a coming of age story at the beginning, which is probably my favorite aspect to it. But definitely it's a little bit slower paced because of the fact that he has to work his way up into a place of importance in society. And again, it's really hard to explain this book without giving away too much. But I will say that the payoff in the later books is worthwhile. This book, of the whole series I've read so far, is my favorite. It's not the final book, there is more to come. But what I like is that the stakes are really high now. And I've said before that this is a series that I consider to be sci-fantasy because while it's definitely set in space, it's set in the future, so it does technically have those science fiction elements. But in terms of the narrative, it feels much more like sci-fantasy. And I've noticed that a lot of the booktubers that give it 5 stars, that just gush about it online, are typically those that read a lot of fantasy and have found this to be a very accessible place to start with science fiction. I will agree to that. So if you're someone who reads a lot of fantasy and want to try science fiction, this series, despite the length of the books and the series itself, is very accessible. It's easy to follow. It's very character focused. The prose are beautiful. If I haven't said that before, they aren't flowery, but they're just really rich and lush, and I do really enjoy that aspect to the books. The world building is interesting, and I think it gets more interesting again in the later books because we start to see a larger world. And if I had a complaint with the earlier books, I often said that they didn't feel like space opera to me, but by the time I get to this book, that has changed. I'm happy to say that this book has definitely given me Star Wars vibes. It just feels very epic in nature. There are big stakes at hand, and you really get to see the larger global politics. And that was my issue perhaps with the beginning of the series, is that while I liked it, it was just a very narrow focus about a man who had lost his way and was trying to find his way back. And now he's involved in these larger politics, and you have the different warring factions, and he's stuck in the middle. And so I found this book to be very fast-paced, very exciting. Despite the length, I flew through it. I understand there's supposed to be another book being published before the end of the year, and I'm grateful for that. This one definitely has a good ending point, so it felt satisfying, but leaves you really wanting more. So if you have not picked up the series, I would generally recommend it. I think that your love of it is going to really depend on whether or not you are a fantasy reader as well, because again, I feel like this book hits on a lot of the tropes that are typically seen more in fantasy narratives, but it's worth sticking it out even for someone like myself, who is someone who tends to prefer more of a space opera feel, because while the beginnings feel more fantasy, as you go along, you really get to see that larger image, that larger picture. And overall, I ended up really enjoying this one, really looking forward to the next, and I'm very grateful to receive a review copy from Daw Books, which I know was a very prized possession among other reviewers. So thank you so much for sending this along. I really do appreciate it. And next up we have Kaiju Preservation Society by John Scalzi. This is his newest release. This story follows a delivery person that loses their job in the midst of the 2020 world events, and he ends up getting offered another job to go and help preserve these animals that are in danger. He goes along and discovers that these animals are actually what are called kaiju, and so they are these mythical Japanese-inspired beasts that they are trying to save. This book is one that I was really eager to pick up because, again, it's John Scalzi. I've read a lot of his books before, and I will say that if you enjoy John Scalzi, this is one that you might want to check out because it has his same iconic witty banter. It's light, it's funny, it's goofy, it's easy to get into. I always say that John Scalzi is very accessible to new science fiction readers, but I will say that I don't think that this is his strongest. If you're new to John Scalzi, I would probably recommend starting with perhaps his more classic and well-loved book, Old Man's War. This one was just very, very light and fluffy. So don't get me wrong, it is set during the pandemic, so it definitely addresses some of those issues, but on a very surface level base, and the author does not really go into any of the politics about any of the things that have made the pandemic so controversial. Instead, he really keeps it light. He just basically focuses on the delivery services that got so popular and uses that to spin this story. Overall, this one was enjoyable, but it was just a little bit too light and fluffy for me in the way that I did not find it to have a lot of substance. In the afterword in this book, the author really describes his writing process and trying to write this book during those events and just needing an escapist read. For me, I prefer my escapist reading to actually be a little bit more deep, just because this book was so surface level that I never really forgot where I was. I never got lost in the book or the story, and it's also incredibly short. So it didn't really land the mark for me, but it was still an enjoyable read. I just don't know if I'm going to be thinking about it down the road. When I go to compile my favorite books of 2022, I honestly don't know if I'm going to remember this one when I come to compile that list, but we shall see. Next up, we have Last Exit by Max Gladstone, and this is a book I received for review from Tor Books as the last one. And this is a really unique literary science fiction book that takes place during a post-apocalyptic future. We follow a woman named Zelda who is trying to survive. She is moving around the American countryside and living in this future. However, this book is also technically fantasy because there is magic, and it explores these topics in a really nuanced, quiet way. This is the kind of book that doesn't always work for me because it's very slow-paced, it's very literary, it's very character focused, and I'll be honest, there isn't a lot of plot that happened in this book, which normally would be a larger complaint for me, but the story was somehow still so good. The prose was absolutely beautiful, and I'm not someone who tends to gush about prose, but it was so well written, and it had some just really complex themes and ideas that the author explored. And so if you're in the mood to just take your time with a book, and I read this one actually quite slowly for me, I just found myself enjoying kind of meandering around. So again, if you're looking for an action-packed post-apocalyptic thrill ride, this is not that book, but for what it was, I thought it was really well done. I definitely want to read more by this author. I think he writes more like urban fantasy, which this book's technically probably best classified under, but like I said, it also has those science fiction elements, and so it just blends the two really nicely together, and like I said, I definitely want to read more by this author because I was really impressed. Next up, we have Skyward Inn by Aliya Whiteley, and this is a book I received from Rebellion Publishing, and this is set in a future where we are following a few people that are running this inn, and you find out that in this future there is an ongoing war, and this inn is almost a place of refuge for those that are trying to escape the war. We follow the owners, and it spins into a larger tale. This is a book that I really hoped that I would love. I thought it was going to be really literary. I thought it was going to be very character focused, and I was ready for that. And it just wasn't really either. I found before with Rebellion that their books either tend to win me over and I absolutely love them, or they kind of miss the mark. And once again, I'm just finding that the narrative in this one was very fragmented, and it just was not a very satisfying read. I couldn't tell if it wanted to be literary or if it wanted to be character focused or if it was meant to be this action story, because there was this narrative that moved along, but the pieces just did not come together for me. So beautiful book. This is the paperback edition that they so kindly sent, but the actual story unfortunately did not work for me, at least personally. Now, switching over to fantasy, I want to talk about The Shadow Glass by Josh Whitting. And this is a book I received from Titan Books. And this is a story of a man whose father was renowned for making these iconic films during the 1980s involving these puppets. His father has passed away and his son is now taking care of his house. And well, possibly the puppets are actually alive and well, things ensue from there. This book is basically a love letter to those of us that love Jim Henson's work. So think of things in the vein of Labyrinth or the Dark Crystal series. And if you love those darker versions of the puppets, then I really think you should check this out. It's clearly meant to be reminiscent of that, but at the same time, it felt very fresh. It didn't feel stale. Instead, it took those ideas and made this really fun story. I want to be clear that while this is technically dark fantasy, it wasn't that dark. So there's a reason I'm including it in my science fiction and fantasy wrap up rather than including it in my horror wrap up. So it's not scary, but it really hits on those beats. It was tropey in the best possible way. It felt just very comforting to read and just made me want to rewatch all of those classic movies. So again, if you're a fan of Jim Henson's darker work, this is definitely the companion fantasy book that you want to be picking up this year. So much fun, highly recommend, and yeah, I just thought it was really enjoyable. And finally, I want to talk about a series I just caught up on. The first book is We Ride the Storms by Devin Madson. This is the first book in the Empire Reborn series. The second book I also read is We Lie with Death. And then the third book, which catches me up to publication, is We Cry for Blood. And the fourth and final book is supposed to be coming out before the end of the year. So if you're interested in the series, this is a really good time to pick it up. If I didn't say, these are books that I received from Orbit for review. And essentially, it's a multi-POV story that follows a couple of different characters. So we have a princess, we have an assassin, and a third character that all kind of get tied together into this epic story. And so you start to see their characters and their storylines blend together as the story goes on, as typically happens with these multi-POV stories. I will say that the characters were fairly likable, but not perhaps the most memorable or distinct. The action was easy to follow. The plot moves along at a good pace. I thought this book had some good narrative drive. And in terms of accessibility, if you don't read tons of fantasy, I do think that these ones are easy to follow. They were fairly tropey and somewhat predictable, but at the same time, it made them very easy to fly through. I binged through the books back to back, and that made for a very enjoyable experience. I just don't know if this is the most memorable series that I have read. I really struggled to give you a really good synopsis without spoiling too much, but I found it just easy to fly through the books, that I am definitely interested enough to finish up the series. I gotta give huge credit, as always, to Orbit's cover designs, because I know they did a beautiful job. If you're not familiar, I believe this series was originally indie published, or at least the first book was, and they did a great job of giving it a facelift because these are absolutely gorgeous. And like I said, I'm definitely interested enough to want to finish out the series once the final book comes out, and I'll give you more of a series review at that point, because it's always hard to talk about a series when it's still ongoing. But again, if you're interested in this one, it's a really good time to get started with them. And yeah, it was a good mix of, like I said, action, characters. It is a little bit inspired by some Asian cultures, which I always enjoy, although I gotta say that those references were pretty mild and it's not own voices, but still an interesting one, just perhaps not a favorite of the year, but still an enjoyable read. So that is it for this video here. I would love to hear of the books I talked about, which ones are you planning on checking out, and especially I'd love to hear your opinions on if you plan to read the Sun Eater series, if you haven't already, or if you've already started it, which book are you on? Are you caught up to date yet? And I would love to hear your opinions on it and kind of which readers that you would recommend it to. If you're new to my channel, please consider subscribing. I do read a lot of science fiction, fantasy, as well as horror and thrillers. You can help me out by sharing this video around online, giving it a thumbs up, dropping a little comment or emoji, even if it's just, I don't know, a book. And otherwise, I will talk to you again soon. Thanks so much for watching. Okay, bye-bye.